My name is Lukasz Mieszkowski. Good morning. Dear participants, dear organizers, thank you very much for the invitation and thank you for giving me opportunity to address you on this unconventional way. It is quite probable that in the autumn of 1918 in Poland, but also in other places all around Europe, people believed that a Black Death had returned. As a Polish journal reported, some physicians supposed that the prevalent epidemic was, neither more nor less, a bubonic plague. It was confirmed by a doctor from Krakow, who found that the clinical picture resembled such a plague, with the mortality reaching 12% in the hospitals of central Poland. On the other hand, the same newspaper denied the gossips that a pneumonic plague had broken out in Germany. But, as you all probably guessed, it was not a plague, it was influenza, the notorious Spanish flu. Today, taking a flu for a plague seems rather strange, but still, at its acute stage, with lungs complication, influenza does resemble a plague, but rather its pneumonic than bubonic variety. A Polish military physician who between November 1918 and July 1920 dealt in a Warsaw Lazaret house with almost 1,000 patients suffering of the influenza, reported a detailed description of the symptoms of the most severe cases. I illustrated it with the rather soft-looking watercolor from the 1920 British flu report. The most sick ones, less than 10% of all cases, developed a last stage of flu complications and hemorrhagic pneumonia. Every desperate attempt at catching a breath ended with the bleedings from the mouth, but also nose, ears, even from the lower body orifices. The infected looked horrible and scary. The destroyed lungs could no more supply the blood with oxygen, and their bodies were taken by cyanosis. The face turned blue, and all the ending parts, lips, ears, nose, fingertips, turned black and died out, causing awful pain. Their faces resembled masks, with swollen eyeballs protruding on both sides of the blackened nose. It was fearful, and fear, as the nervous system infection symptom, was an eminent part of the epidemic. It was experienced by the sick, who, as it is reported, sometimes knocked the window and jumped out onto the street and ran around frantic with fear, but it was also experienced by the unaffected ones, who, confronted with the symptoms and the scale of the epidemics, were no less prone to fear. And, like the Black Death, the Spanish flu broke the consensus, according to which they were children and the old ones who were to fall victim, rather than anyone else. This time, nobody was safe. In contrary, men and women in their prime were the most endangered. Listening to this, it is easier, at least for me, to understand how familiar common flu epidemic could be taken for a medieval horrific plague. If we can agree that in 1918 entire Europe was an epidemiological tinderbox, then the Polish lands were a dynamite stick put into it. Most of the residents of the country, devastated by war and the economic policies of its occupiers, had basically nothing to eat and nowhere to live. Like in 1812, in 1915, during the so-called Grey Retreat from the Kingdom of Poland, the Russian army employed the burned land tactics, destroying the villages, crops, and driving eastward millions of banished small farmers. Those who managed to stay and save their farms were wrecked by predatory requisitions. Early in the spring of 1919, a delegate of the Ministry of Labor and Social Care reported to the headquarters that in one of the eastern districts of the former Russian partition, a mere 10% of the rural population could survive till the harvest on their own. 60% of them, so-called refugees in Polish and runaways, bieżeńcy in Russian, who managed to return from expulsion into Russia, were shabby, infected, they lived in sheds or in post-war trenches turned into improvised shelters. And they were living on the tree bark and on bread made out of straw. Any livestock or food supplies that miraculously survived the war was looted by the racketeering gangs or as ruthless Polish army or gendarmerie troops. In one of the Mazovian land estates, on behalf of the Kertesz lady who was locked in an inside asylum, the administrator reinstated a serfdom system. The situation was a bit better in urban areas, but even from there are recorded cases of famine-driven suicides. There was a currency chaos, inflation grew bigger and bigger. Since the withdrawal of the German administration, prices had grown twofold to fourfold. With the industry in 3 years evacuated 2 times in 2 opposite directions and utterly destroyed, joblessness reached 90%. The dreadful living conditions expectedly sparked the dissemination of the disease. The sanitary conditions, which were kept decent during the war, mainly owing to a cordon set up by German and Austrian services, eventually broke down. The sanitary defense system, based on mostly compulsory baths, delousing, vaccination and quarantine stations, was in ruins. The installations partly evacuated and partly pillaged, local doctors, nurses and paramedics hunted down by the emerging Polish army. Hospital lacked medical personnel, medicines, clean utilities, underclothes and linen, and foodstuffs. Patients in one provincial hospital were fed with stew made of crows, shot every morning by the manager. All this made the hospitals hotbeds of contagious diseases. Epidemics of smallpox, dysentery, even cholera were breaking out. Tuberculosis and venereal diseases, both endemic, intensified. Then, in autumn and early winter of 1918, already present typhus and influenza went deadly. The example of influenza shows that a global war can go hand in hand with a global epidemic, a pandemic. According to the latest findings of Christopher Langford from the London School of Economics, the Spanish flu virus developed in China in 1917 and traveled around the world with members of the Chinese Labor Corps. 1 year later, in huge military camps on the French coast of the English Channel, virus finally mutated into its deadly variation in the bodies of soldiers from all around the world, as well as pigs and domestic birds. The epidemic broke out in Poland the same time it did in the West, in the summer of 1918. When the weather changed for worse, those who had been affected started to die. A detailed report issued in 1920 by the United Kingdom Ministry of Health, describing the course of the flu pandemic, contains a whole lot of maps, tables and data from countries as exotic as the Samoan Islands. There is an exception, though. The statistical map of Europe sketched by His Majesty Civil Servant featured a wild spot extending from Szczecin, Wrocław and Prague up to Kiev and Petrograd. For the other areas, an attempt, or at least a fragmentary description of the development of the plague was made, or a short commentary was added explaining that no information was available. Regarding to Poland, nothing is said, as if the country did not at all exist, politically or even geographically. For a historian searching for reliable knowledge, this is quite frustrating, but also quite symptomatic. The volume and the course of the entire Polish sanitary crisis, for the most part, remains a puzzle. According to my own very general estimates, which, due to almost complete lack of data on the subject, I reconstructed in cooperation with Professor Brydak, a national flu officer in the Hygiene Institute in Warsaw, in 3 huge seasonally recurring waves of the influenza epidemic in the late autumn of 1918, 1919 and 1920, between 3.5 million to 6.5 million of the 26 million people living in the country may have got sick annually. The death toll ranged from 50,000 to 100,000 annually, approximately 1.5% of the total. Just for an example, last year, which was a record in terms of flu dissemination, 4 out of 38 million Poles contracted the disease, and 120 of them died. Influenza in Poland had a rival in typhus and other diseases, and I don't mean it as a joke. It has to be borne in mind that in the beginning of the 20th century, Poland, contrary to the countries of Western Europe, had not yet went through a so-called process of epidemiological transformation, that is, structural change in the reasons of deaths, from infectious diseases and high baby mortality rates into persistent or chronic diseases. The influenza virus and typhus bacillus were literally competing against each other as well as against other microbes and parasites for access to bodies of their host. Typhus appearance in the Kingdom of Poland and Galicia was endemic. In the course of the combined German and Austro-Hungarian offensive of 1915, the retreat of the Russian army and the refugee crisis, a typhus epidemic broke out in the east and was not suppressed until the war ended. According to the official report of the Ministry of Public Health, by the mid-1919, more than 320,000 cases were recorded, with some 20,000 lost lives. Almost half of them in the first half of 1919. Both typhus and flu featured similar symptoms: high fever, headache, cardiac and nervous system disorders. Rash and blotches, so typical for typhus, also occurred with flu, just like flu-like symptoms of cyanosis appeared alongside typhus. Certainly, at the time both epidemics prevailed in Poland, a whole lot of cases of typhus were recognized as a flu, and the other way round. Influenza is a viral disease, but it is known only from 1933, a year of its isolation. On the eve of the pandemic outbreak, it was commonly believed that influenza was a bacterial disease caused by Bacillus influenzae. But this hypothesis quickly turned out to be wrong, and the treatments resulting from it ineffective. Since no pathogenic germ had been discovered, and all the attempts at preventing the pandemic ended up in failure, the illness lost its political and social potential, and the patients became completely unattractive to the outer world. The persistent, visible for example in Polish journals and in official state-issued instructions, trend to associate the Spanish flu with contaminated dust, miasmal air and awful hygienic conditions, contrary in many aspects to the scientific findings and common sense, attempted to place the illness within a useful social context. Fear of dirt, decomposition and dissemination called up for being turned into a metaphor, challenge, embodied. Those nasty, ugly things were the characteristic of a state emerging on the rubble and debris. Struggle with the crisis required time, patience, enormous effort, and money. And as none of those was available at the moment, rituals and incantations were put to work. Notably, the first paragraph of the first joint instruction of the Ministry of Public Health and Ministry of Internal Affairs called upon the residents of the state of Poland to universally and carefully cleanse themselves as well as their apartments, equipments, clothing, underwear and linen of any and all dirt and vermin. American oncologist and author Siddhartha Mukherjee, in his brilliant biography of cancer, The Emperor of Maladies, states, "When a disease insinuates itself so potently into the imagination of an era, it is often because it impinges on an anxiety latent within this imagination." And then he gives the example of AIDS, which in the 80s hit the Western world underbelly. All the dilemmas related to the sexual revolution ended 10 years earlier. And of cancer, which underline the anxiety of those rich and safe societies in which external fears, such as war, famine, or contagious diseases, have been replaced by an internal ones, materializing in the form of dementia, decomposition, and tumor. Spanish flu, one of the great plagues of the entire history, didn't really got into the imagination of an era and was confined to individual experience only. Facing it, as Virginia Woolf once put it, everyone created its own narration of the illness. From 1918 to 1920, the influenza did what it could to be remembered, to become a symbol of its time, to turn from an epidemic into a plague. But in most of places, all around the world, excluding the United States probably, because of the lack of its social and metaphorical potential, it failed and is often referred to as forgotten pandemic. It may seem that the same scenario unfolded in Poland, where the Spanish flu epidemic did not earn itself a prominent place in the collective memory. However, in my opinion, this fact should not be interpreted as the same way as in the epidemiologically transformed West. Here, the memory of the flu competed with the other elements of an acute epidemiological crisis, not to mention the rapid progression of political and social changes which had priority over medical news. Influenza considerably drove up the death toll and increased the intensity of the plague, of which it was an important but not the sole and most visible part. The other element of the plague, perhaps even more important from the social, political and medical point of view, was typhus. But this is a different story. Thank you very much for your attention.